Hello, everybody. Salutations in Christ. This is the Three Arms Podcast, where we engage in ecumenical dialogue about current Christian events, theology, exposing heresy, promoting orthodoxy, and hopefully bringing clarity and unity to the body. We are happy to have you all as listeners. Keep us in your prayers and enjoy the episode. Well, folks, we are back. Three Arms Podcast. No, you missed us, but here we are once again. Eveline, what wonderful things are we going to be talking about today?
We are talking about the recent Amazon Prime original show that came out January 18th, 2024, Hazbin Hotel. It stirred up quite a bit of controversy from sort of the release of the trailer in Christian circles. I think, Carol, when did you watch it?
I want to say a couple months ago, some friends wanted to get together and watch it out of sort of critique the plot more than anything, because we had seen it had started to get a lot of traction, and obviously, at least from an outside perspective, the show has an interesting sort of plot. Well, we were expecting better things from it, obviously, but we assumed it'd be sort of like a metaphysical comedy, not dissimilar to the Divine Comedy, of course. We were very wrong. We thought it would at least play on some of those themes, but not really. But yeah, watched it a couple months ago, just with some associates. I guess sort of what we're here to talk about is it harmful? Is it a piece of art that is actually detrimental to society?
I think I watched it around the same time you did. How I found out about it was I got a message from a very close friend who is like a sister to me, and she sent me this video of Isabel Brown, who is a rising star in the sort of conservative commentary, Christian commentary space. I'm under the impression that she is Catholic, but I could be wrong about that. It also seems that she works for Turning Point USA, or is at least affiliated with them in some way, and I mention that not to disparage the conservative side, but just to sort of point that out, because obviously certain organizations definitely play off a little bit more of the shall we say inflammatory form of commentary. And as soon as I saw it, I was already a little bit concerned, but the show hadn't even come out yet, so people were kind of reacting to the trailer and getting really, really upset about it. And one misconception that seemed to be like circulating at the time was that the TV show was for children, and it was being aimed at really like young kids, which it's R-rated. So I can't say, I don't think the aim was young children. I think the aim was probably more 15 to 25, like maybe that age range of young adults, similar to the young adult novel space, if you're familiar with that, which is 14 to 25. Yeah, it was really weird. So I kind of came home one day from school and just sat down and watched the whole thing from 1 to 6, and then I watched the rest of it when it came out. So I had a bit of a break in between the episodes. And yeah, I can't say I was particularly impressed by anything. I mean, there were some things I really liked. There was things I disliked. But I can't say I was particularly offended in any way, because it didn't seem to me to be really aimed at Christians or Christianity for that matter. It was sort of just generally taking the idea of heaven and hell and a bit of Jewish and Christian theological premises, and then running sort of its own course, storyline, and narrative with it. So it was kind of more just inspiration, fan fiction adjacent type of thing. Like, it really wasn't aimed at Christianity and meant to desecrate our beliefs or anything like that.
I think I agree with you there, and part of the reason that is because Hazbin Hotel, right, the plot, the actual lore of the show, isn't really connected to Christian ideas about spirituality or the afterlife. Like, it's sort of thematically very based off of some of the notions we have about the afterlife. But at the end of the day, right, the plot, the arc of the story, how things work, what an angel is, what a demon is, interactions between the two, things like that, is all sort of like self-contained. Like, it's its own mythology, right? And so even though it takes sort of aesthetic and thematic inspiration from, like you said, Judeo-Christian sort of understandings about spirituality and the afterlife, it's not meant to be slanderous or anything like that. And yeah, it's the narrative is pretty contrived, I would say, based off of that. Like, it's not supposed to be a story written from the other perspective, if you will,
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I personally have not watched the first episode that was released in like 2018 on YouTube. At least in the Amazon show, the first thing we're sort of introduced to our storyline and characters through is this version of the creation story. that I personally found very strange. The story kind of goes in at least the TV show that Lucifer is this big dreamer type of person. And he gets it in his head to do something and give human beings a special knowledge and stuff like that. But the Council of Seraphim don't agree with him on this. And then also, for some reason, Adam is like this really horrible person. And originally is married to Lilith, but then she is too feisty for him or something. Like she stands up to him and doesn't agree with him. So he kind of divorces her in the scenario and she goes off and marries Lucifer. And then Eve is there at some point, but they don't actually talk that much about Eve, interestingly enough, and she doesn't come up, at least in the first season, it seems. And so basically, Lucifer ends up banished from heaven because he's too hopeful. Like that's kind of the narrative they're trying to draw, which if you're at all familiar with like Christian theology, Lucifer falls from heaven long before the creation story takes place. So I just think that that was already a bit of an odd choice there, and I can understand why people may have been under the impression that they were trying to make Lucifer look really good through this narrative of, oh, he was just a dreamer who wanted to give people free will and all this different stuff. But like, to be perfectly honest, they kind of just portray Lucifer as an idiot. He's not portrayed as like some good person or good spirit being. Another thing that was really weird about the show is they kind of insinuate that when people die, they become angels and or demons.
A brief note about that. For any brethren who may be confused, and when I say this, I mean absolutely no offense. You see a lot of people, mostly Christians, right, just out of virtue of the fact that Christians are one of the biggest religious groups in America that believe in an afterlife, posting, right, relatives or whatever, or anything like that, or when people have died, they go up to heaven, they say that they're like an angel. Just not actually how that works, right? Because humans and angels are distinct things. You can certainly go to heaven and be a saint. That's sort of that's the hope. But you aren't actually substantially changed into a different kind of being. Because the thing is, right, angels and demons are beings of pure spirit, unlike humans. Humans have bodies. And so yeah, when you die, like you're sort of erroneously you would be sharing the same belief as Hazbin Hotel, that when you die
Right.
you become you become an angel or a demon. That's something we could spend a whole episode on. It's a common cultural misconception. But going back to the main point, I think one thing you said is that Lucifer is sort of portrayed as an idiot in the show. I agree with you. I'm not sure if that was an intentional choice on the part of the creators. I think that's true though. I guess if you like really critically analyze the plot, I can't see how you would think that Satan is at all the victim or the good guy or whatever. Short of the fact that he's like the main character's father, but that's pretty much it. Because the show pretty explicitly states in the whole like sort of background lore segment, right, that sort of sets up the basis for the whole show, that Satan is the one, well, Lucifer, they don't call him Satan, is the one they state pretty explicitly that he was the one who brought evil and corruption into the world by
Yeah,
deceiving humans or tempting them to disobey God, right? And it's like,
right.
and they assert that's the one it's the one way in which their narrative, this sort of, this fictional the mythological narrative and then the actual biblical narrative coincide, is that through this singular and grave act of disobedience against heaven, evil and injustice and corruption and etc. spreads throughout the earth.
Yeah.
But besides that, there's there's nothing else.
To ensure the sinners in hell don't rebel against heaven, the seraphim create this like this yearly extermination where a whole bunch of angels like go down and kill demons and like the souls of sinners to stop them from, who even knows what they're gonna, like, I don't even know what they thought they were gonna do. It's basically like to keep them on their side of hell
Right.
so that they don't come to heaven. Which, if you've read the Gospels, there's a story about that, and that you kind of can't, like, Satan can cross over, but I don't think anybody else can. But yeah, also one thing that we should also note is that God literally does not exist in this storyline at all, which is also, I suppose, a little bit concerning, but also I really would not like to see how Hazbin Hotel would view God. So I'm like, oh, I don't know. I'm not mad about this.
Any mythological narrative that doesn't have sort of some idea about creation, it's always odd to me because, you sort of end up with the classic causal paradox there, and it's like, well, where did heaven come from? You know, so I guess within their mythology, because there is no God, heaven and hell are just, well, hell seems to have come into existence at a certain point based off of the introduction, but heaven just seems to be a sort of that being is something that is just sort of constant, and like heaven is like intrinsically like a part of that constant existence, or like
Yeah.
the ultimate form of it, which is odd to say the least. I mean, I don't even know what the point of hell is if the characters are able to go between heaven and hell. Spoiler alert. Just
Yeah.
in case, spoiler
Just in
alert, the
case.
characters can go between heaven and hell, and they do at one point.
You need a special permission from the Council of Seraphim, which, again, also the depictions, I appreciated the fact that they acknowledged that there are different types of angels. However, they seem to be bit confused about what their roles in heaven are, and also, like, it was kind of interesting seeing the way they categorize people who went to hell and people who went to heaven as well, because to be honest, like the way Adam was acting through the entirety of the show, I was like, I don't think if Adam was really like this, he would have made it to heaven. I'm gonna be really honest, because this degree of like arrogance, not caring for others, murderous intention for others, just being generally very, very unkind. That's the type of
Yeah.
there's verses in the Bible about that. Haughtiness, and oh, what was some of the other stuff? He was obviously promiscuous at some point and just like a lot of different things. I was like, oh,
Yeah,
I
he's
don't
not a
know.
shining icon of masculinity, to say the least.
Yeah.
But I mean, what's interesting about Hazbin Hotel is that they sort of actually don't really understand like how heaven and hell work. They're sort of creating their own mythology, playing off of the Christian understanding of the afterlife. But the thing is, like, we can't merit our way into heaven. But that seems to be the only way you can get into heaven in Hazbin Hotel because there's no God. So there's no one to be merciful to you. So the gates are opened for like people who do good stuff, and that's about it. But
Yeah.
in terms of what you said about how people are sort of divided between heaven and hell, it seems that only people in hell seem to be drug addicts, alcohol abusers, and sort of things of that nature. Not only does that seem to be like the only criteria of hell, like, or it seems like what people think, like stereotypical fundamentalist Christians or like Southern Christians think, who ends up in hell. And they sort of just take all the people and make it the main character. But it was just like a really odd decision. And it also, like you said, the only difference in, the people who are in hell and the people who are in heaven seems to be sort of like how they dress, because Adam is not, a good guy. He seems super like wrathful and cruel throughout the whole thing. And there are people in hell, right? The main character, obviously, first and foremost, who like I think you can say, at least within the confines of the narrative's morals, that she's a pretty upstanding character, right? The whole motivation in why it's called Has Been Hotel is because she wants to make a place of refuge for all the sinners and others in hell who desire, I guess, some sort of, not necessarily repentance. I mean, I think that's a part of it in the show, but just like, I guess, want to distance themselves from their identity as sinners. It's a noble cause, right, within the mythology at least. And it's odd because how you get into heaven isn't super consistent, because although she's doing this good thing, doing something that you would think that the people in heaven in this story would do, she's still in hell, and heaven seems to be at pretty great odds with her.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because I also noticed that I think it was a little bit concerning to me, just the fact that also her girlfriend is portrayed as noble for leaving heaven. And I think they were also trying to maybe do something with the story and narrative where they set up heaven as an example of a group of oppressors, and then like the people of hell is more accepting and more in need of liberation, which I'm wondering if that's supposed to be more in line with like a political message, not relating to religion or anything like that, but just talking about sort of the oppressor versus oppressed dynamic and how people suffer in lieu of hierarchies even existing.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's a pretty apt description. As much as the show does have a lot of plot inconsistencies, and as much as the humor is pretty repetitive, and it's just sort of like beating you over the head with a bat made of obscenity, and like that's really all they have. And as much as there are some, there's some pretty gratuitous and unnecessary content. Besides that, that is one of the few points you can give the show is that the way that it sort of deals with, I guess you could say, the trope of like an oppressed but troubled group, and then a group sort of infatuated with their own goodness, right? And the conflict between the two is, admittedly, there's some nuance there, right? It's a pretty cool theme, something which a lot of great works have played with and have talked about, right? But yeah, I think that's fairly accurate. I think if you could describe the show in one way, it's sort of about that. But it's not like, it's definitely not the same kind of struggle between heaven and hell that, like, we see in the hearts of men in real life. And for people who enjoy it, go ahead, enjoy it. But don't make any judgments about religion or discernments about your own spirituality based off of this content because it's not designed
Yes.
for that.
Yes. So the primary conflict of the show, I would say, kind of comes from this extermination thing that they do once a year is now going to be every 6 months. That's kind of the narrative they're trying to draw there, that they're trying to keep the numbers of hell down, which I don't understand how you kill a soul.
That was one of the things that confused me the first time I saw the show because I had seen like the first episode a long time beforehand, back when it had like just come out as a pilot. But it's sort of, it doesn't, you're right, it doesn't really make any sense because, okay, so you've died, right? Your mortal vessel has passed on, right? And you're now experiencing, your eternal judgment, right? And so you're here in hell. So this guy Angel Dust walks around the corner and just wastes you with a machine gun, right? So where do you go from there? Is there a second layer? Are there infinite layers of hell, each of which you can die in? Do
Yeah.
eventually you get to the real permanent hell? They say in the show that you're like double dead, I think. That's the
Yeah.
vocabulary they use without really elaborating on that. So my guess, my uninformed guess is that sort of, in the confines of the show, if you're killed in hell or killed in heaven or what have you, you pretty much just enter a state of total non-being. But that's confusing because then that seems to assert that every being which exists is capable of taking things out of existence, properly speaking, which philosophically seems like a sort of a really absurd thing to say.
Yeah, that was also, yeah, I would agree with what Carol said. I think that was a bit of an interesting choice. And I'm sure as the show goes on, they'll probably explore that more and fill in plot holes, hopefully. I don't know when they're saying season two is coming out. I imagine it's going to be later this year because I have a feeling the creators of the show probably already have like at least 2 to 3 seasons done and are just planning to release them periodically. But I can't confirm that. I'm not in the know about production times of Hazbin Hotel. But yeah, so that's kind of like the central conflict here is that they're going to move up the extermination time to every 6 months. And so the main character, Charlie, who is the daughter of Lilith and Lucifer, is now trying to pitch to heaven a rehabilitation program for the sinners of hell to eventually migrate into heaven. And so the first episode's kind of just like them finding that out, her trying to figure out how she's gonna save her people in the next 6 months. And that's basically like the first episode. And then the second episode, we're kind of introduced to this secondary conflict in the story about these overlords of the underworld called the V's, Vox, Valentino, and Velvet. And they kind of like run the media sort of portion of the underworld, and they are in direct competition with a main character named Alistair, who has disappeared for the last 7 years in the timeline of the story and is also is he confirmed or just suspected to be owned by Lilith? That's another thing about Hazbin Hotel is the whole concept they're playing with of people owning each other's souls in the underworld, and through that ownership basically being able to like run their lives and control what they do.
one of the things that kept as sort of a theme in the forefront of the show, right, is the ownership, and stuff like that. But that sort of comes from like, devils and demons and stuff, like making deals with each other. And so if you make like Alistair, like I mean, I don't know if I call him the big bad guy. He's technically a protagonist, but he's pretty bad and scary and mysterious. There's this one scene where the main character is like hesitant to make like a deal with him because she fears the consequences or how she might be bound to him through that deal or whatever. But I thought it was sort of like a pretty interesting way of conveying leverage between characters. Of course, there's all sorts of problems. Like what if two super powerful demons make a deal with each other? What happens then? Who owns who? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, that was an interesting thing. The character of Alistair is portrayed to be like a radio host, and his sort of, shall we say, arch nemesis is Vox, who is the controller of television and media. And one of the main jokes of the show, which at the beginning I found a little bit disturbing, was actually okay with how they handled it later, is that entertainment in hell is basically explicit material of a certain nature that some would argue should be illegalized. If you know, you know. And one of the main characters, Angel, is a star in sort of this industry, is a celebrity in this industry, and is friends with Charlie and owned by Vox. And that comes up in the first episode, he is avoiding interacting with Vox. It seems to be a very, very like toxic type of abusive trafficking-esque situation. Vox holds a great deal of leverage over Angel and forces Angel to do a lot of things that are just very soul-killing. That is one part of the show I would say is a bit dark and very, very heavy, so I would not necessarily recommend the show to anyone on that sort of basis, just because it can be a little bit sobering. But I did appreciate the fact that they acknowledged sort of that there's certain behaviors and industries that can be very harmful, even if they are highly normalized and highly accepted in society. And I thought that was actually really great messaging. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Carol.
I thought it was a little bit ironic that like sort of this character's Angel Dust, this whole trope is his involvement in the production of this stuff and like the negative effects it has on his life and like how it's, made him majorly addicted to substances. I think it's sort of ironic that all this terrible stuff, right, which proceeds from this degeneracy he repeatedly engages in, like is sort of just played off as like that's what his character is, haha. That's his character. But don't you see the problem there? I think generally, I think it's sort of become a much bigger thing in modern media, and maybe it's just because I hate modern things generally. But the trope of like some sort of detrimental aspect of a character, like constituting their entire character, is like a really common thing. It's sort of like an edginess thing, right? Because Angel Dust is so messed up. He's sort of cool. He's mysterious. He doesn't have everything clean cut. And I think humans have always sort of been drawn to narratives like that, right? Someone fighting uphill because they're in like a bad situation, right? And because they have bad things that are a part of them. But it's like I only really find those narratives interesting, and I only really objectively think those narratives are beautiful and compelling when it's someone who has this disadvantage, but instead of just sort of wallowing in that and making it their whole character, actually tries to overcome it, or at the least sees how they can live with it and work around it to pursue success. Whereas a character like Angel Dust or I'm sure if I thought long and hard of it, I could think of plenty of other characters from books and movies who are like this. But character like Angel Dust is just sort of like, oh, well, I'm addicted to drugs and I, produce bad content. And that's sort of what I do. And I'm very quirky because of that. For anyone who's wondering, my favorite character in Hazbin Hotel, those little egg minion guys, since
Oh,
they're
yeah.
they're just sort of doing their own thing. I mess with that.
Oh, they're so funny. I forgot about them. I would agree partially with Carol. I think it was also very interesting seeing the way Angel's friends, like Charlie and Vaggie and the bartender character, I'm blanking on his name, and the little maid that they have. I found it an interesting sort of dichotomy in the fact that his friends try to pull him out of it a lot, but this contract he has with Vox keeps him very much pulled into this lifestyle, and it's very clear in certain parts of the show that he's like really tired of living his life this way and is like at the end of his rope, but then goes out and does other things to cope with this that just seem to make the problem significantly worse for him. He sort of, at certain points of the show, refuses help, push people away when they try to pull him out of it. In a way, it was realistic because I think if you've ever dealt with somebody who has an addiction to something or is coming out of some relationship, whether friendship or romantic or whatever, that's kind of not positive, some of the cognitive dissonance that can go along with it, and also how we as mortal beings tend to go to other things that will cause other problems to put a band-aid on the real problem rather than dealing with the root cause of the conflict between the soul, the spirit, and the flesh. And so I found that a little bit interesting. The second episode kind of deals with that conflict between Angel and Vox, and then the conflict between Vox and Alistair. And it goes on and on. There's a whole bunch of like mini plots for every episode that involve murder and rivalries and different things. And then there's a lot of plots that are happening around the main plot. It's very interesting, but also kind of hard to keep straight at certain points because it's like, wait, okay, so there's this group of people and they're doing this thing, but they're in conflict with this group of people, but wait, this person over here is doing that thing, and wait, but what about these people? So obviously a highly complex narrative. However, its execution at some points is a little bit sloppy. And that's really my only criticism of the storytelling. I think it has a lot of potential to get better as it goes on. Episode 3 has the egg minions that Carol was talking about. And during all of this, Charlie, the main character, is desperately running around trying to get this hotel up and running and get people in. And there's this snake character who has the egg henchman who decides that he wants to improve as a person, but also wants to kill Alistair. So this is sort of the episode where we kind of like get a lot more information about sort of the running of the underworld, because although Lucifer is supposed to be running things, he is in like this major aggressive episode where all he does is sit around and like make and play with rubber ducks.
Sounds kind of like me, to be honest.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
yeah, after remembering that detail, it's a lot more clear what we mentioned earlier. He's not the wily and cunning and vicious, adversary
Yeah.
that of course exists in reality. He's just sort of like he's kind of like a child. Like he just sort of does things according to his most immediate passions.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that's just seems to be sitting around and making rubber ducks. But hey, all power to him if that's what makes him happy, I guess.
Watch Christians watch the show and then come up with like a conspiracy theory that rubber ducks are the children of Lucifer, and now their kids can't play with rubber ducks because Satan was playing with them in one show.
Oh boy.
But yeah, no, it's really weird because Charlie, I don't know if she is supposed to be an adult or a teenager. She's definitely older because at this point Lilith has left her husband and her daughter behind and was like, "Yeah, actually, this is not for me. I am tired of you. I don't want to deal with my child. So I'm just gonna dip out. See you guys later." And Lucifer is like this burnt out, completely disconnected from his own child. I don't know if they explored in the show whether or not he misses his wife at all, but he just seems to be disappointed in himself for his failure. He's just kind of there being miserable, not really doing anything. And so this, I guess, has led to the rise of like this underground group of overlords of hell. They're like the robber barons of souls. They control all of the commerce, all of like the big industries of hell, which I think is probably a criticism of capitalism, knowing the direction that the show has been going on so far.
Right. I mean, at this point, what works of fiction don't lodge some sort of criticism of capitalism? It
Yeah,
just seems to be sort of standard for shows these days. I think a lot of it's warranted, definitely, but it
oh,
is
for sure.
it is uh it is a pretty common theme. But I think I'd agree with you there. That's a pretty good analysis of it.
Yeah, and it was also interesting because it kind of reminded me of Arcane. And if you haven't seen Arcane and you want to watch like an animated show that's like targeted at older people, I would recommend Arcane. I think it's great. I don't
Perhaps
know if
I
you've seen
perhaps I shall. So you said it's called Arcane?
Arcane. It's on Netflix. It's based off of the League of Legends video game, I think. And
Interesting.
so it's very well done. I remember the reason I got into it was there's this YouTuber who does like these analysis of different TV and movies and sort of their writing techniques and storytelling, character building stuff. And as a writer, I like to watch that sort of stuff because it gives me ideas of like how to connect better with an audience. Also, it's just interesting to learn how they market things to people, and it's very informative because I am definitely a media consumer and I like to know how and why I feel the way I do about things if I'm not already mostly aware. And he also actually did a couple videos. I think he's done quite a few on Hazbin Hotel, and he seems to think that the character building and stuff is pretty good. And I would agree. I think when Hazbin Hotel is done as a show and it's no longer running, it'll be interesting to sort of maybe go back and look over everything then, because there may just be things in the first season that are not making sense that they already have rounded out for the ending, because I find it hard to believe they don't already know how they want the show to end. This doesn't seem to be like a show to me that's just going to keep running and running and running. Like, this show has to have an end.
Well, I would hope so at least.
The interesting thing with the Overlords and how this reminded me of Arcane is that there's a lot of political conflict in Arcane, because there's like these two worlds, and it's sort of like the similar oppressor versus oppressed dynamic they have going on, where there's this like upper world where everything is shiny and good and there's all this new technology and the leaders of everything are up there and they kind of make decisions that affect the underworld but don't really care about the people in the underworld. And it's not as in heaven, hell, upper and under. It's like, I forget what they call it because I haven't watched the show in a really long time. But it's upper and under, as in literally there's a city under the city. And the lower you go, the darker things get. And the more criminal, sort of overlord mafia types are running the show. So that was kind of, I felt like, a theme I've seen a lot recently in this sort of media and just generally stories involving, shall we say, conflicts between people, is this belief there is always going to be somebody above somebody else, and the people on top are always going to either be very unaware of the way their work is harming other people, or they're going to be aware and not care, and then there's going to be people underneath that within the oppressors who are going to further oppress the people who are being oppressed because they are selfish. Yeah, it's just very, very interesting seeing that conflict. I feel like Arcane did a really, really good job with that. It wasn't quite as rounded out in this one. I will say it was interesting in this one, though, because they had like a council of the underworld. A couple of the characters were like really concerned with like the well-being of their own people, but 90% of the people at the table were like, how can I better myself in my situations?
There's a lot of self-centeredness in the show, I think, in a lot of the characters. But I mean, usually, I think in a traditional narrative, right, flaws, vices, self-centeredness are always things that serve to the downfall of the character, and then the character rises back up to goodness once they realize they need to let go of those things. But it's sort of odd because it seems like the example of Angel Dust, right? It seems like being self-centered, apathetic, addicted to drugs, and continuing in degenerate behavior is like sort of just like it's just a path for it's just a successful path for him. And so I thought that was kind of odd.
But of course, it is supposed to be hell, and that doesn't work in heaven, which we are going to get to heaven in a minute. As Carol mentioned, Angel Dust, episode 4, which is entitled Masquerade, shows Angel Dust basically go back to Valentino. Charlie is trying to really get Angel Dust out of like this lifestyle he's in and is really pushing it. And there's like moments where you can clearly see Angel does not want to do what he's doing anymore. He wants
Right.
out. But this soul contract or whatever it is keeping him from being able to sort of break free of that. And so Charlie goes to Angel Dust's studio where he's supposed to be working with Valentino. And Valentino is under Vox. So, like, when I said earlier that Vox is perpetrating abuse against Angel, he's perpetrating most of his abuse through Valentino. What ends up happening is that Valentino takes extreme offense at Charlie's interference, physically hurts Angel Dust. Angel gets mad at Charlie and has like this like 72-hour work period or something, like is extraordinarily overworked in this very violent line of work that he's in, and ends up going to a bar afterward. And then the bartender from the hotel, whose name I just remembered as Husk, has to go get him and is like encouraging him to keep going with his life and like make better choices. That was a very dark episode. And then Angel ends up going back to the hotel, makes up with Charlie, and Charlie's like really welcoming and everything like that. So that's kind of what goes on there.
Yeah, I think that was the only episode I skipped actually.
It was hard to stomach. It definitely cast Angel in a light where we are, as the watchers, meant to understand his situation a lot more and sympathize with him because it's clear that this is not something he wants, but it's something he has to do. I mean, I appreciated it in the sense that it didn't try to romanticize anything, but I also had to skip through some of it just because I found it a little bit gratuitous
For
in
sure,
some of
yeah.
its content. I will say that is something about the show. It's like sometimes you can just allude to things. And I think
Right.
because the show is definitely trying to appeal to an audience of people who think they're edgy or like is trying in a way to appeal to people who consider themselves intellectuals or pseudo intellectuals, it does try to be very in your face and shock value-y, but
Right.
not in the sense that it's trying to like make fun of religion. So Charlie, all through all of this, and her girlfriend Vaggie are just trying to figure out how to go to heaven and get this plan to have the extermination in 6 months stopped. And so, with nothing left to kind of, I guess, get them there, she calls her dad. But basically, what ends up happening is he shows up at the hotel and he and Alistair don't get along with each other. Alistair suddenly starts playing up that he's like Charlie's second father, which makes Lucifer really, really mad. And at that point, there's also something about Alistair being owned that we find out. The show is definitely trying to push us in the direction that Alistair and Charlie's mom have some connection to one another. Because her mom at this point, I think, has also been gone for 7 years in the storyline.
I think so, yeah.
So yeah, they disappeared around the same time and then he just comes back. So anyway, Lucifer is very, very upset about Charlie wanting to go to heaven because he truly believes it is impossible because sinners are inherently evil and heaven will never listen to her. If we can just address that from a theological perspective. Carol, you have a really good explanation for this. Why don't you take this one?
Think of it this way: if the forces of heaven never availed the pleas of sinners, then everything would be really bad for everyone all the time, right? I think this is a good thing to address generally because that's sort of how we avoid despair, right? This is how we avoid despairing of God is by understanding that even though we are sinners, that doesn't mean that God doesn't listen to us, right? I mean, think of St. Paul, for example. He was up there in terms of relative badness, right? But, God has an ability to change people, and God didn't not listen to him because he was a sinner, right? And of course, within the show, it doesn't really make any sense because, I mean, that's a plot hole in my opinion, right? Is, the people in heaven, they think, okay, hell is a place for bad people, right? That's where all the bad people go. But then Charlie, right, the main character, is just evidently not that bad, right? She's trying to do something good, trying to do something admirable. And I don't know, I guess they still don't like her, but I think a little bit ties back into what we were saying earlier about this sort of the idea of prejudice, right, between one group and another, right? And
Yeah.
I think there's that for sure, but it's not something that really holds up in real life theology that actually exists because of course God listens to sinners. If he wasn't, then no one would be allowed to pray ever. So,
This kind of makes sense, I guess, in the story because again, God is not involved at all in this narrative. Like he's just not there. And it's not even like he's not there, he's mentioned. It's like he does not exist in the storyline. I don't know if they plan later on in the Hazbin Hotel lore to introduce a god character or figure. It's very deist in nature. Like if you're familiar with the historical sort of perspectives of our founding fathers and a lot of intellectuals from that time period about the role of God and how God exists. It's basically that God exists. There is a force that exists that has had a hand in creation, but has sort of stepped back and is impersonal. And so I feel like in this storyline, that takes that sort of misconception and belief to another level where it's like the angels are running everything, the demons are running everything. Satan exists, but again, Satan is a fallen angel. So that kind of makes sense in the storyline. I think one misconception people have is that Satan and God are opposites to one another, and it's like, no, God created Satan. Satan will forever be under God because he is not in any way, shape, or form on the equal level of God in terms of power, ability, knowledge, or anything of that nature.
yeah, I think that's definitely a very popular misconception is that, as you said, right, people think that God and the devil are on the same level. But I mean, the truth is, sort of substantially, the devil is the same as any angel, right? Obviously, he doesn't occupy the same roles and authorities, but they're kind of the same thing, which is that they're beings of pure spirit. But Satan came into being at a distinct point, right? God did
Yeah.
not. And that's why he's God. So don't ever confuse the two because there was a time when Satan did not exist. Outside of the material world, it's talking about time is a difficult thing to do, right? Because time doesn't really exist outside of the material world. But you get what I'm saying, right? Satan was
Yes.
created, God was not.
Yeah, and I think also for people who are not familiar with the story of the fall of Lucifer, a lot of times, and I'm writing this in the post for Christianity, which is why it's taking me a while because I have to go find all the references for this. But the story is in the New Testament. And I think it's also mentioned in the Old Testament. I'm forgetting where exactly it is. But it's basically that Lucifer was God's favorite angel. He was the angel of music. And bringing that up, this does remind me one of the ideas that you will hear in certain Christian circles. This is a total side note and somewhat of a tangent, is that music has the power to let demons into your life and that sort of stuff. And the argument a lot of times people will make for that is that Satan was in heaven when he was in heaven, the angel of music. So this therefore somehow means that he can still utilize music to allow people to, like, I guess, invite demons into their life and this sort of stuff, which again, I would emphasize the part of allow. I definitely think there has been a lot of interesting research done about how certain frequencies affect the brain, how certain music and lyrics can affect a person's psyche, and I would be happy to do an episode on that later. But yeah, just that's sort of where that belief I think comes from a little bit. I wanted to mention that. But back to the story, Satan gets very full of himself and basically goes and sits on the throne of God and declares himself like the ruler of heaven. He gets it into his head that he is equal and or better than God and should be in charge of heaven. And so this then causes a war between God and his angels and the angels that have sided with Lucifer. Lucifer obviously loses, and that is the point in which hell is created. And all of that precedes the Genesis narrative. So I think that's important to mention because hell was not created for people, it was created for Satan and his demons. And in this narrative here in Hazbin Hotel, that definitely, plays a part as to what Carol was saying, in that people have this like really weird idea that like God enjoys sending people to hell, and or God has certain groups of people he is always meant to be in hell, when in reality it was the sort of sinful willfulness of people and the enemy that have allowed sin to enter the world and have caused rebellion against God, and rebellion has consequences. It is not so much that being a certain way or having certain struggles will land you in hell. It is the arrogance, I would say, and the sort of intentional, shall we say, malice of people to commit sins that are harmful to themselves and other people and desecrate God's creation as well as God's will and plan. And I think that's what people oftentimes really misunderstand about that narrative.
For sure. And I also think, I mean, I guess I'd have to do more research in the doctrinal backing of this, but I guess sort of from a, speculative perspective, you could kind of say that you can't really end up in hell against your will, because if you didn't want to be in hell, then there would be necessarily some kind of repentance within you, right? And if there is genuine repentance for your sin, I mean, obviously I can't speak to there's a very limited degree based off of what has been revealed to us, right? To which we can speak to the judgment of God, right? But I think you could say, just based off of the fact that if you didn't want to be in hell, you would be repentant to a degree. There's really no way you could unwillingly end up in hell. So there's that to consider, and I think a lot of people miss that.
Catholics still hold to purgatory being a thing, right?
Right, but so, well,
How does that work? Sorry, just for Protestant audiences who may not be familiar.
no, yeah, you're good. There's a lot of misconstruing about purgatory that goes on. First and foremost, I would like to state that the Divine Comedy is not a source of doctrine for the Catholic Church. It's just a poem, right? It doesn't represent the actual metaphysical reality. It's just supposed to be sort of a visual way to think about it and to write about it, right? What purgatory is, and really all purgatory is the completion of your sanctification after you're dead, right? Because I think there are very, very, very few individuals who at the end of their life would say, yep, I'm perfectly holy, I can just waltz straight into heaven. I really don't think anyone should say that. It seems sort of presumptuous, but we have faith in our salvation, right? And think of it this way, right? To deny that God has any will to sanctify you perfectly after you're dead, right? If you haven't cooperated with with the graces God has given you on earth, to deny that is to sort of deny that God really cares about you, that the sort of the day of your death, no matter what it may be, it's just sort of after that God doesn't really care. And that like you had your time here, but after that his love sort of ceases for you if you're not perfectly holy, right? Because at the end of the day, who is perfectly holy when they die, right? So all purgatory is the completion of your sanctification after you die, if it has not happened while you were alive. There are many great saints who skip the waiting line, right? I mean, that's a colloquial term, right? Purgatory isn't just a waiting line. If you're martyred, you walk straight through the gates of heaven, right? There's the accusation a lot that purgatory is just you sit around and do nothing. That's not really what it is, right? We can't, much like it's very difficult to tell what heaven is like, and much like it's very difficult to tell what hell is like, whether purgatory consists of, tough manual labor for many centuries or something like that, we don't really know. I've never been there, so there's that. But yeah, all purgatory is it's the completion of your journey of sanctification if it hasn't been completed on earth, right? Because in one of the most common examples I think brought up, and one of the best ones I use, is a person who dies, a follower of Christ who's made their best efforts to follow Christ and to cooperate with the grace and mercy that God has given them, right? Dies still, having a drug problem. Is there no mercy afforded and given by God, someone of infinite mercy, to that person, right? And I suppose as Catholics collectively, we would say there is. So that's why purgatory is a thing. But I think there are a lot of people who are quick to condemn it just sort of based off of the fact that it sounds interesting. But it's a lot more simple than other people think.
Yeah, I was just wondering how that would play into sort of the lore and criticisms we have of Hazbin Hotel, because I know that is somewhat important, I would say, of a distinction between Protestantism and Catholicism in sort of our belief of the afterlife, and what that consists of. So thank you very much for sharing. But yeah, by the end of episode 5, basically Lucifer has decided he's going to arrange this meeting with heaven. Basically, she and her girlfriend, who, again, I don't know if I mentioned this already, but her girlfriend is a former angel, travel to heaven to go attend this trial intended to decide whether souls in hell are worth redemption. And they're welcomed by the head of the Seraphim and Emily,
Fellow seraphim alongside Sarah.
Adam and his posse are very upset about this whole thing coming to pass because they actually really enjoy the extermination. They find it fun. In Christianity, enjoying murdering people is not something that will get you into heaven. That's not something generally we would overlook. I think this is very interesting because you kind of hear this I guess question sometimes from Reddit atheists that kind of goes along the lines of if Hitler repented on his last day he would go to heaven, but somebody whose worst sin is just not knowing God or not following God or being unaware of God would get them sent to hell. And I always think that's a really weird thing because I think it just completely misunderstands repentance. Repentance quite literally means to turn away from. So it would have to be a genuine acknowledgement that what you did was wrong, and also that you don't want to do that, and that you're sorry for doing that. Similarly to how the Apostle Paul went from Saul to Paul, where he had actually gone and killed Christians and had been very anti-Christian, and then ended up having a spiritual experience that caused him to literally go and get to know God through this new understanding, and then later entered into ministry after years of being discipled himself. So I think that's always a weird thing, and I think that is part of this understanding of this mythology, that there are some people who are inherently holy and some who are sinners, and the people who are sinners are judged too harshly because if you really look at it, the people who are inherently holy, so to speak, are really holier than thou, and I guess have their own sin that they're unwilling to deal with, which in a setting on earth, this would be an interesting thing to explore. In the context of heaven and hell, this makes no sense. This doesn't hold up to Christian theology. There's also, of course, the passage in the Bible in the New Testament that speaks about somebody who did things in the name of God but had no relationship with God getting sent to hell. Adam is threatening Vaggie because she hasn't told Charlie that she is formally an angel. And so the trial begins after this. And they start watching from heaven the actions of Angel Dust, who on this particular night has decided to go to a nightclub with his friend. And so it kind of goes into this whole thing where they're like going back and forth about sort of who deserves to be in hell, who doesn't. And then Charlie begins to like question what the meaning of redemption is, what the meaning of sin is, what the meaning of repentance is, what the meaning of holy is, and nobody can give her an answer. Oh my gosh.
It's kind of just confusing and inconsistent. Actually, a friend of mine while we were watching it, he had a theory that both heaven and hell in the show were actually just hell, and that heaven is just a sort of an illusory place, but it's still part of hell. It's just where really proud people go, I guess.
Yeah,
Which
that's what
seems
I
to be
would,
more
yeah.
consistent, honestly.
Yeah, that kind of is how the show portrays heaven, to be honest. So while all of this is going on, we find out that a lot of people in heaven had no idea the extermination was even happening, which that is not good. Also, what we may have forgotten to mention is the show's also a musical. So there's a lot of songs that act as fillers to this narrative, and there's this one line of a song that Charlie and Emily sing together. It's like, if hell is forever, then heaven is a lie.
That just
I just know.
I don't
Wait.
understand where that's coming from. Like that's just sort of like, man, if I like grapefruits, then the sky is actually green. That doesn't seem to follow philosophically from what you originally stated, but all right. You
Yeah.
know what? I at a certain point with the show when it comes to like things like that, you just sort of lose hope with it and you have to focus on, okay, I'm just going to focus on the musical numbers because that's kind of the only good thing about it.
Yeah, there's a lot of syllogistic logic going on here and just very much Reddit atheism, as I said before. Like, 12-year-old just discovered atheism as a thing and wants to rebel against their parents, and so starts using Sky Daddy as a disrespectful term towards God and starts reading, like, I don't know, books by Richard Dawkins and quoting them verbatim, thinking they sound intellectual. And that's kind of like the whole energy of the show's critiques of theology, because there are definitely parts of the show where I think they are trying to critique Christian theology a little bit, but it's generally very subtle and not meant to be offensive. It's just genuinely a critique. So it's just always a little bit interesting with this sort of narrative and things they try to draw. But yeah, it's pretty bad. And so anyway, this whole council of whatever this is supposed to be ends up sending Charlie and Vaggie back. There will be no redemption for sinners. And so that's how that episode ends, and then it goes into episode 7. So episode 7, kind of what ends up happening is Vaggie finally reveals that she was an angel, and Charlie gets really upset about this because she didn't know, and so Alistair ends up making a deal with her. Basically, he takes advantage of her emotional state. She agrees to make a deal with him to do an unknown favor whenever he asks her to. Oh, and this was something in an earlier episode. One of the overlords knows how to kill the exterminators, which is something that also doesn't make very much sense in the show, because the angels can kill the demons, but the demons can't kill them back. Yeah, and so basically he reveals to her that there's some way, and then they end up going to Cannibal Town. They go meet Rosie there. Rosie and the cannibals all agree to basically fend off the angels, because apparently they can get rid of angels. You know, different people are teaching different people how to fight off the angels. And so episode 8 is the last episode, and it was released on February the 1st. Basically, they get ready for this like final battle, and Charlie and Vaggie share this like sweet moment together, where she's like just encouraging her that they're gonna be fine. Da, 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 da. It's just a typical like romance scene that you would see in like any "it's the last battle, we could all be dead tomorrow" type of thing. And then Extermination Day arrives, and Alistair fights Adam. The snake confesses his love to the friend who Angel went out to the bar with, and then I think subsequently dies for a little bit. Charlie gets really mad and then enters like a full demonic form, totally goes after Adam. Meanwhile, her girlfriend is fighting Adam's sidekick who took away her eye. Everybody's fighting each other, and finally Lucifer gets there and overpowers Adam, who is then killed by that little childlike adult thing with one eye, Nifty. Nifty's like a murderous toddler. That's the only way to explain her character. If you've worked in
Pretty
children's
much.
ministry, you know what that's like, and it can be very scary. So yeah, that whole thing happens. And so Charlie rebuilds the hotel with her friends, and then the snake ends up in heaven. as an angel. Imagine that, because he sacrificed himself for his friends, and that means, he's good now. He's been absolved of all the wrong he's ever done in whatever past life it was that he had. And this thus means the people of hell, the demons or whatever, can be redeemed to go to heaven. So Adam's sidekick takes over the exterminations. And then this is where the only time we see Lilith in the entire show. She goes to Lilith and she's like, your little brat causing problems in the equilibrium of heaven and hell, and you need to do something about it. And Lilith is like sitting on a beach doing nothing. So that's how the show's first season ends. It's definitely problematic in some sense, in the fact that I think some people are going to watch this and are probably going to think that this is in some way really reflective of Christian theology on both sides.
For sure, but, based off of that, if you were listening well, I think you can reasonably discern for yourself that this show, isn't supposed to be a reflection of Christianity or isn't supposed to be a critique of it. It's just sort of its own self-contained lore. And, I think certainly it draws on Christian aesthetics and things like that, but it'd only really be as harmful as you want it to be, Is it directed towards children? No, right? It's rated R, and there are plenty of other animations that are not directed toward children, like Family Guy and The Simpsons. Beyond that, it has its plot holes, certainly, as Eveline has definitely shown you guys in her pretty apt description of the show. And it does have some nuance to it, and it does have some good things, and it has a lot of bad things. But ultimately, my personal recommendation is watch it if you're really, really, really bored and don't really want to watch anything else. Or just don't watch it. If you are going to watch it, it's not going to ruin your life.
Yeah, I think if you're like a musical theater kid, I think you'll enjoy it. If you're a choir kid, you'll probably enjoy it. I like that the show is giving us the opportunity to, in a way, have open dialogue with non-believers about what it is we really believe. Because I feel like a lot of times what we as Christians do when we see things in the media, we don't even know, but we feel is going to portray us badly, we just get offended, rather than stepping into a spirit of humility. And as the Bible instructs us, be ready to respond to every critique and question that non-believers are going to have of us. And I think this is just a really great opportunity for us, because I know a lot of non-believers who love the show, who think it's really, really great. I think this is just like a moment for us to really maybe interact with this content with the intention of opening dialogue and opening conversation, saying, listen, if you liked this storyline about redemption, you might try the actual Bible, because that has a pretty great story of redemption in it. And I mean, Hazbin Hotel is basically just like a fan fiction of Christian theology, if we're being really honest.
I'd say so, yeah.
Why not read the real thing? Why not try The Chosen? Why not, point them in directions where they can better understand this, rather than just getting offended?
Well, we'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on the show. This has been a pretty long episode thus far. I think this is pushing the record for what we have. But of course, post-production and all that. But I definitely think we should do a lot more media analysis like this, because there's a lot of content to go through. And, there's so many movie recommendations I have from friends and from listeners of the show that I haven't seen and that I would just love to talk about with you guys. And yeah. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, would you like to lead us in the closing prayer here?
Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel.
Amen. Thanks for listening, guys. Thanks for tuning in. And we'll see y'all on the next one.
Thank you for joining us on the Three Arms podcast, where Carol, Thaddeus Martin, and I, Eveline Goldsmith, engage in an ecumenical dialogue about current Christian events, theology, exposing heresy, promoting orthodoxy, and striving to bring clarity and unity to the body of Christ. We thank you all for listening to us today and encourage our listeners to continue to join us on this journey. If you've enjoyed our discussion and would like to see us grow, please consider sharing this podcast with your friends and family. By doing so, you can help us reach a wider audience and continue to foster dialogue and understanding within the Christian community and beyond its barriers. Let others know that we are here to provide a space where Christians can come together, share their thoughts, and engage in meaningful discussions. Together, we can contribute to the reunifying and expansion of Christendom. Thank you once again for joining us on this expedition, and until next time, may God bless you abundantly.